Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to address a topic that I'm seeing a lot of for a good reason. And the good reason is that 2020 has really made a lot of people realize that they would like to homestead, which is wonderful. But what I'm seeing is a lot of people just don't know where to start. Primarily because they get overwhelmed. They think, oh, I gotta have solar power and I've gotta have animals for meat and I've gotta have a big garden and I gotta learn to can and I've gotta do this and I've gotta do that to have a real homestead. And then they don't know where to start. I remember what that is like. It's been a few years, but I remember. So today I just want to talk about my advice for where to start and the steps that are required. So before I start though, I want to say that homesteading is about skills. It's not about stuff or even necessarily land. You do have to have some land, and you probably are not going to be able to grow all your food if you live in the suburbs, certainly not if you live in the city. But we also have to remember that even in the old days, nobody was completely self-sufficient. So homesteading and self-sufficiency tend to go kind of hand in hand, but we need to remember that people have always relied upon going into town and buying certain supplies or relying upon their neighbors, that kind of thing. So first start with realistic goals. Let's say you're super wealthy and you buy a bunch of land and you can pay people to throw up your homestead right away. They build you a house, they set up the chicken coop, and they give you all kinds of fencing for other animals. They set up this big garden. There's, a greenhouse, there's a root cellar, all the things that might be on your wish list are just there. I would never recommend that method to anyone, even if you can afford it. And the reason is skills. So if you try to take on a bunch of new homesteading skills all at once, you are going to be so overwhelmed and stressed out, and you're going to have a lot of failure. There's always a certain amount of failure in homesteading. Some of it we can control by learning better techniques, and some of it we can't. We can't change the weather if there's a drought or, excessive wind or something that ruins our crops. But the truth of the matter is, if you're taking on a bunch of new things, that's not the way to go. You want to take on maybe one, maybe two at most things that are new to you at a time. You'll still make some mistakes, but you'll be far less overwhelmed. You're going to save more money because you're not failing at a gazillion things at once. And you're going to be more able to learn from your mistakes. So don't think you have to do it all at once. I know people are they feel an urgency this year because 2020, but relax, breathe, it'll be okay. Just start smaller and you can work your way up. You're gonna enjoy yourself more and you're gonna be more successful if that's what you do. So you don't homestead at all, and it doesn't matter where you live, you should just start now. If you live in a city, join a community garden. Grow things on your windowsill, on your balcony, any space, your rooftop maybe. Start doing that now because you're learning skills that you're going to apply when you are able to move to a place that has more land for you to use. The same thing is true if you are in a suburban area. You can do a lot on a suburban homestead, as I'm sure Pinterest has shown you. But so you can grow food, you can even raise animals for eggs and meat. Start now and build your skills. Because like I said, starting small, you're gonna build those skills more readily. So let's just assume that you live in the suburbs, because probably most of you who want a homestead do. By all means, save money and start looking for land if you live in the city or the suburbs. But in the meantime, I would start, first things first, with a vegetable garden. So unless you eat carnivore, almost all of you eat vegetables, and whatever you grow is going to be 1,000 times better than what you can buy in the grocery store. And if you do it right, starting your plants by seed, you will likely save money as well. Now, there can be some startup costs getting your soil in the right condition and all that. So, homesteading isn't always about saving money. Often you can save money, but it's typically more about the high quality of the food and perhaps for some people, self-sufficiency. So start a vegetable garden. I don't care where, make it not huge is the best idea, because a lot of times people, their first year, they plant this big garden and then they get overwhelmed by weeds, usually is the big thing. Or if they have any failures, it's a bigger deal. So people who think they can read a gardening book and then just instantly go grow their own food are living in a fantasy world. It's not that simple. It takes practice, and it takes know-how that you'll only gain by actually doing it. So start there. Then that first year perhaps, or maybe the next year, learn to preserve. So you can start with easy things like dehydrating and freezing correctly, but then eventually you probably are going to want to learn how to can. So get those skills down. Even if you're not filling your pantry with entirely homemade, home-canned foods or whatever the case might be. Start small, build your pantry. And while you're building your pantry, you can think also about what you would do in cases of emergency. So, for example, I would recommend that you have some water on hand. I know that can be tricky when you don't have a lot of space, but if the power goes out, you should have some bottled water on hand. And I'll let you do the research about how much and so forth you think you need for your family. But the important thing is just to have a few jugs or bottles or whatever somewhere in your garage, or maybe in your pantry or under the bed, whatever. You're ready in case the power goes out. Another important thing to think about is what your heat will be if the power goes out. Where I live, we sometimes have extended power outages. And so having a good non-electric way to keep warm is vitally important. So I understand not everybody's going to have a wood stove or live in an area where wood is easy to get or cheap. So you kind of have to look at what works for you and in your area. It might just be a little indoor safe propane heater and you have a propane tank in your backyard. There are lots of possibilities. You can also think about light. This is less important than food and water and keeping warm, but you will really appreciate it if you have some way to have lights on when the power goes out. That could just be flashlights, or it might be oil lamps. You figure that out. This is all part of homesteading too, being prepared for when, there's a hurricane or a tornado or whatever is typical natural disaster in your area. Okay, so now you've got your garden, you've got a way to preserve your food, and you have a little bit just basic stuff that everybody should have on hand if there's a power outage or a natural disaster. Now I recommend that if you eat eggs, you go ahead and get an animal that lays eggs. I do believe chickens are the easiest, but you can consider ducks. The trouble with ducks is they can be messier and noisier and more difficult unless you live in a rural area. You can also consider quail. Quail lay little teeny tiny eggs, so you need a lot more of them. Also, they can be kind of stinky, and so when you have nearby neighbors, and you have to be a lot more careful, right? You don't want the neighbors turning you in, and then you have to relinquish your animals and all that crazy stuff. So chickens are quieter, they're less smelly. I think they're the easiest choice for most people who don't live in a rural area. So I would recommend that you would have, if you don't want to ever buy eggs at the grocery store again, I would recommend at least 2 chickens, 2 hens, per person in your family. You will want to check with your local government to make sure there aren't laws forbidding hens and how many you should have. Unfortunately, some areas still have those really out-of-date laws, but the good news is a lot of areas are revising those laws because they realize a lot of people want to have backyard hens. So if your area is an area where they aren't allowing these kinds of things, maybe you can be the person to help change that. And by the way, if you're living where there's an HOA, the very first thing I would recommend you do is leave. Find a different place to live. And what a nightmare. I've heard just terrible stories. Even the most beautifully kept vegetable gardens in the front yard can be a problem. So for some people, moving out of an HOA neighborhood may be the first step. Okay, now you've got your vegetable garden, you're preserving, you're ready for, a basic emergency. You have eggs. I think the next step is meat. So let's just assume you're still in the suburbs. There are ways you can raise meat. You can raise chickens that are specific for meat. You could raise rabbits. You could raise quail. You might be able to raise other poultry too. It just is going to depend on how big your yard is and the rules in your area and your neighbors, right? So all three of the animals I mentioned though, chickens, quail, and rabbits, take up very little space. And they're relatively quiet. Quail are probably the noisiest, and as I've mentioned, they can be kind of stinky, or their poop can be. So you might, if you are raising those and have close neighbors, you may have to clean their poop trays daily or spread some lime on their poop. But you can easily now you have your vegetables. You are preserving them. You are ready for emergency. You have eggs, you have meat. You can also learn to forage for wild fruit in your area, or maybe you can plant some. I used to have, when I lived in the suburbs, columnar apple trees because that was all I had room for. You could do patio fruit trees. There are so many possibilities from there. But if you just do the steps I've outlined, the vegetables, the preserving, the ready for emergencies, the eggs, and then maybe the meat, you will be so far ahead of most people, and so far ahead of all the people who are sitting there thinking, oh, I gotta go buy land before I can homestead. So homesteading in the suburbs is totally doable. It's even doable to a certain extent if you live in a city, as I've mentioned. It doesn't always have to be about going out and living in a rural area. And like I've said, you wouldn't really be ready for that anyway. So I guess the moral of this video, if there is one, is to start where you are, go step by step, and practice some patience about it. I know it's hard. I have been there and done that. But this is the path, I believe, to homesteading success. Thank you for joining me, and if you have questions, please leave a comment. I will read it. I will answer it if I can. And I hope that you'll also check out my blog. I'll put the link in the description. There's tons of homesteading information there, including lots of links to get you started on all the topics that I have discussed here today. Thanks again. Bye.